Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we're reviewing The Iron Claw. Written and directed by Sean Durkin, The Iron Claw is based on the life of professional wrestler Kevin Von Erich and the Von Erich family. The film stars Zac Efron, Jeremy Allen White, Harris Dickinson, and many more. So Jeffrey, what did you think about The Iron Claw?
Sean Durkin, I think, is probably most well known for Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, which was this big hit out of Sundance in 2011. One of the most acclaimed films of that year, and also one of my favorite films of like the past 15 years. I absolutely adore that film. Its control of tension, it's this kind of grim outlook that it has on the world that I found really affecting and extremely suspenseful and quite concise. I mean, sometimes concision and suspense go nicely together. Sean Durkin didn't follow up that film for a whole 9 years until he made The Nest in 2020, which was also one of my favorite films of 2020. I don't think quite as skillfully made as his first film, but it had Carrie Coon and Jude Law, who are terrific actors. It was a film that I think was sort of plainly written, but he just directed the hell out of it. It's a wonderful film. I revisited it recently, and I think it really held up from watching it a couple of years ago. This film, I'd say that I liked, but is a pretty distant third for me, in my opinion. I think with each successive project, I'm noticing that Durkin is a great director, but not necessarily a great screenwriter. That's something that's very effectively hidden in his first film, in Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, because it has so much of that grim, foreboding tension, and it structures itself between the present day and the past, and it creates that natural suspense because you're not really sure where the film is going. But even as I think back to that film, there's a line that Elizabeth Olsen says to Sarah Paulson. She just says, "You're a bad mother," which I can imagine somebody writing that line, and I would say, yeah, that's just too plain. I have to write something else, from my head, coming from a writer's like literary perspective. But because that film had so much more going on, I think it hid the seams of its flaws quite a bit better. The Nest is the first time where I said, this script is very average, but he's directing the hell out of this movie, and it's very, very well directed and very effective for those reasons. And then The Iron Claw seems to be tipping that scale kind of yet again, where I look at the script and I say, man, this is really plainly written, and there's a lot of things that I would do differently here from a writing perspective. Yet there is so much to admire, I think, from a directorial perspective that I've always really enjoyed about Durkin. The barrier for me is that I just simply didn't feel invested enough in the story because, and I have my reasons for that we'll get into, but some of the reactions I'm reading from people are very, very positive. So, and I probably will give the film like an ultimate quote unquote thumbs up, like give it a positive review that you should go see it. But there seemed to be a lot of glowing emotional reactions to this movie that I just didn't tap into. I think that if you feel emotionally involved in the film too, you're able to forgive more of its misgivings. But because I wasn't that involved, it was a little bit harder. Kind of like what I talked about with Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene. Because I found that film suspenseful and well acted, I didn't necessarily feel that the lines were badly written because the film was so effective on all these other levels.
For the most part, I do agree with you. I think for someone like myself who does not follow wrestling, I do think this movie was very illuminating from that perspective. I learned a lot about the industry, how it works. I learned a lot about the physical toll it takes on your body, even though it's very much staged. From the standpoint where I'm not really a fan of wrestling in general, I think maybe something about that separates me from the movie or makes me not feel as emotionally connected to it. That being said, I don't think the movie really did a great job of tapping my emotions.
I was going to say, I think there's a lot of films that we've seen that are about subjects I really don't care about that make me care about those subjects, which this film didn't necessarily do.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons for that is I found this film to be extremely restrained. I think it made a very clear and intentional choice not to sensationalize all these tragedies. There is so much tragedy built into this story that it takes up pretty much the entirety of the runtime of the film, just tragedy thing. But I think because it spent so much time focusing so much on this restraint, I think it was unable in the end to convey like a meaningful message for me. Besides some notable moments such as a physical altercation between Efron's character and that of his father, and another scene with Maura Tierney's character where she's overlooking a black dress in a scene, I would say I felt pretty hollow throughout the movie.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to what you were talking about with restraint because I think that's a very good point. Usually we talk about restraint as a good thing in our reviews. And I think that when we talk about restraint as a good thing, we're often talking about a whole sea of subtext and emotions that are beneath the surface that the characters aren't necessarily talking about, but are obvious from the writing or the acting that you should be tapping into those things, which in my opinion, this film just simply doesn't have. Walking out of the theater, this is one of the things I was contemplating, is am I just putting too high of expectations on this film because it needs to get through all of these story beats in 2 hours and all of these tragedies? And should I really be blaming it for not going as psychologically deep as it is? And then I thought of filmmakers like Kelly Reichardt. I thought of the film Passages from earlier this year. That sounds like an odd comparison, but the characters don't often say how they're feeling, but from these very finely tuned, very interestingly written scenes and their physical presence with each other, you can tell what's going on and what's in the subtext if you're paying attention. Unless I missed it, I just didn't see a whole lot of that in this film. I think there could have been a lot more small character details that showed us so much about these characters, and yet it was really missing. I think the first hour of the film was a lot of bonding between the boys, and I really enjoyed a lot of that, but there could have been a little bit more of the details that make a fine characterization that this film just simply didn't have.
Yeah, and I could point out two characters that really struggled with that in this film, I think. For example, Maura Tierney's character, she plays the mom, and she has like three scenes in this movie that I would say are pretty notable. They're pretty run-of-the-mill. The subtext doesn't really extend itself beyond these three scenes, and most of them involve her being a disconnected mother. One where she doesn't really want to get involved in the boys' relationships with their dad, with the boys' relationships with each other. She's very much disconnected from playing a role of having any influence on them, which I wish was engaged with a little bit more in the movie.
So before you move on from the mom, did you find her final moment in the film painting kind of like oddly poignant?
I did, yeah. I
did
wish
too.
there was more of it. That's why
I wish there was more of
yeah.
that. And there's the scene, it's very early in the film, so I don't think it's a spoiler, where Zac Efron's character says, "You have to talk to Dad. He's too hard on Michael." And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." And I thought that would develop into some kind of psychological depth or tension. And it is there throughout the film, but it's never really developed. It just kind of stays in this static, quiet tension.
Yeah, we get so few of those moments, and those were the moments I was really invested in. So I wish there was more of that happening. And the same goes for Holt McCallany's character. He plays the patriarch of the family, Fritz Von Erich. He is very much utilized in the same way, where there's a lot of undertones to how he is as a parent. He's very hands-offish when he doesn't want to get involved. And then on the other front, he is so invested in winning at any cost necessary that he puts his own children at risk. And there are a few toxic ways in which this appears in conversations with his sons, where he's setting his expectations for them on very high levels at ways which some of them can't even compete because they're just not physically able, as one of the sons is. I thought he was very underutilized in this film when it came to the middle of the film. I thought we saw a lot of him in the beginning, and then we see a few moments of him at the end. But the middle of the film, I felt, abandoned him for whatever reason. I think to fit in all the tragedies, because all the tragedies start piling up. I feel like he is one of the main reasons why the tragedies are happening.
He's
because
oddly one of the most complex characters.
He is.
Yeah.
He is. He was my favorite character of the movie. I just felt like he was utilized and abandoned throughout the middle portion of the film, when he has so much at stake during that part of the film because he is mostly responsible. To just abandon his character in the middle of the film, I thought was a weird choice to make.
Yeah, I was contemplating his character a lot on the way home. I don't watch wrestling currently, but I went through a phase in 6th and 7th grade where I was like really into wrestling for 2 years. So much of the mythos kind of thing about wrestling is your character needs to make their own mythology about themselves. You think of like The Undertaker, he has this grim, scary outlook. He comes out of a coffin or whatever. He has that interesting backstory. Ric Flair is like super rich. We saw Ric Flair in this movie, or we saw an actor of Ric Flair. He's like super rich and flamboyant and crazy, and that's his mythology. And I think the film shows when a man or potentially a whole family confuses the show business mythology with their family's legacy. So the father is like so obstinate and he's so narrow-minded about this particular achievement in wrestling that he doesn't realize that his sole focus on that is destroying his family. And that's fascinating, right? I don't think the film ever totally capitalizes on that. There are moments where I see it and I'm like, oh, wow, that's very impactful, but it never fully comes to fruition. There's a lot of focus on Zac Efron's character and there's a lot of focus on Jeremy Allen White's character. I think both of those performances are pretty good, but again, whether it's the script, whether it's the direction, whether it's something, I never truly felt the depth or the complexity of those characters.
And those things are quite literally lurking under the surface in this film, which is something I really wish that it had gone further into. Going back to Zac Efron's character, he is very much cut from a different cloth than everybody else in this movie because he is empathetic, he's caring. You could sense that he cares about his brother's well-being in multiple scenes, and he cares about his own well-being and where he's going in the future. You could tell he's not wanting to follow the same path as his father. But for some reason, all that is just skirting under the surface in this movie when I wish they would have engaged with that a bit more.
Another thing with the father and the sons is this film is almost like a machismo King Lear. So he's playing his sons against one another, and he's favoring different sons outwardly and telling them so, based off how they're fulfilling his vision for, his own mythology that has failed him in the past.
One of those scenes includes a scene where he literally ranks his sons from favorite to less favorite.
And there was a person 2 seats over from us that was just like, that's up like out loud. I thought that was really funny, but it was so on the nose with how not okay that is. It takes that one idea and barely explores it and just expects you to take that fact and follow it throughout the film.
That being said, I do think Zac Efron did a wonderful job playing this role. I do think the end was very poignant when he has a moment with his sons, and you could tell that he's learned new lessons from his experiences with his family, and he isn't going to pass those same things down to his own children.
I want to talk about the direction of the film. Let me put it on you, actually. What did you think of the direction and the camera work, or did you not think about it?
To be honest, I was quite bored.
Oh, really?
I'm sorry.
I thought he directed it pretty well, I have to say. But he has a way of using the camera that I think clearly he plans down to the details, as all directors do. But he has a way of using the camera that seems very refreshingly uncomplicated. He uses a lot of handheld work, but the simplicity of the framing, I think, is something that I found really effective. There's this great scene in the bathroom stall at Kevin's wedding.
Yes, I agree.
That's very simply framed, and I thought that was very effective. For instance, he uses a slow zoom in these moments of great tension to build tension. And again, it's very simple, but it's a gut-punching technique, I think. I think I saw a lot of subtle skill here, and I am, I could be saying this just because I really like this director, but I do think it was directed better than it was written.
I do agree with that assessment. When I said I was bored, I think it more has to do with the pacing of the film, and I think that comes down to certain editing techniques and filming techniques. There were some notable moments. There was one where they were looking for the younger son, looking through the fields of the house, and it's a very wide shot from a distance. I really like that shot, but same also with the bathroom shot. I really like that one as well. The very subtle techniques of using the camera in a still fashion, paying attention to a place that a character is paying attention to, where off in the distance something else is occurring. I remember that particular with Jeremy Allen White, when his tragedy unfolds near the end of the movie. The camera is doing something very simplistic on Zac Efron's character, and where Jeremy Allen White's character is in the scene. I think it's something about all these tragedies and having to fit them into one movie. Even the movie itself neglected to include one of the brothers. So one of the brothers is completely absent from this movie when he was involved the entire time.
Which I think is a very odd choice.
Yeah, so I was reading that he was taken out because his tragedy was very similar to one of the other brothers. So they decided to somewhat combine the two brothers into Jeremy Allen White's character. I understand that, but it does feel like a whole person is just missing from the family just for time constraints. I think that had affected the pacing of the movie, which is what made me feel a little bit bored.
I don't mean this in the cruel way that it sounds, but at a certain point, it almost feels like a checklist of just tragedies.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
Especially with them all relegated to this second half of the film, it's just like, okay, that happened, and okay, that happened. And for me, and again, a lot of people feel very differently about this movie than you and I do. For me, it didn't have a cumulative effect of just wow. And again, this is a true story, so this is something that actually happened. For whatever reason, the filmmaking didn't have its effect on me the way it typically does.
On the note of the camera work that you were talking about, I do want to mention one other scene of note that I found to be very cool, with a moving camera shot that went through crowds in line for the wrestling match.
Oh, yeah, I remember that shot.
Yeah, and they go all the way up to where somebody hands a ticket at the door. But I thought that was a really good moment and a really good world-building scene. So you ready to go to grades?
I am. I think I'm going to give this film a B-. So I think that the writing just left a lot to be desired. The characters could have been sharper. I think the themes could have been more intricately explored. There could have been a lot of these more character details that I really wish the film had had. Durkin has an amazing talent for this looming sense of ominous and darkness that's just really missing from this film. His films they're always domestic dramas, but they always border on being almost like horror movies. There's an extended scene in The Nest where there's almost like a supernatural element that's never really explored, but it adds this interesting mystique to the film and the atmosphere that I really enjoyed. There's an extended scene where they're burying a horse in The Nest that is quite grim and quite disturbing, and the whole thing of Martha, Marcy, Marlene is disturbing. So anyway, I think he has such a talent for this grim tension, a very particular grim tension that no other filmmaker I can think of gives me the same sense of dread. I hope that he continues that, just because I don't feel like I'm really getting that type of filmmaking elsewhere. And this film severely lacked that. It's a difficult thing because I don't want to put Sean Durkin in a box and say, do this thing over and over. But at the same time, this film, he tried something, I think, a little bit more humanist, a little bit more heartfelt, and I don't think he was quite as successful at it.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that, and I pretty much agree. I give this movie a C+. I think what it is for me is this balancing act between telling a true story and fitting all these tragedies into one film, along with having something to say, I don't think he really reckoned with merging these two things into one thing. And that's one of the reasons why I think the movie fell flat with me. So I just wish it had a little bit more in terms of something to say and how it fit into the historical story that it is.
And that's it for a review of The Iron Claw, which is now in theaters. Please check it out and let us know what you think. I know that a lot of people like this film a lot better than we do, so please let us know what we're missing. Give us your opinions in the comments, and we will see you next time.